that's beyond cultural responsiveness. It's beyond adding a diverse book in your curriculum. It's beyond hiring and quantifying how many BIPOC staff members you have and faculty members in your school and assuming that you've checked that off of your list. And it's beyond a 15-minute webinar. And it's not a one and done. It's a framework lifestyle change. It's systemic. It's from the top down, the bottom up, and all around. And it extends itself outside of the community in every possible way. And if we're not thinking about it in all of those ways, then we're not doing equity work because it's not disrupting. It's a Band-Aid. And a Band-Aid can only last so long when you have a gashing wound that's bleeding.
I just want to say I am so honored to be getting to have this conversation with the three of you because the brain power at this table is enormous. And we are so lucky to be able to hear from all three of you what it is that if we're wrapping up ISTE in the lens of equity, what should we be thinking about with equity going forward? As we go into the next school year, as we try and dismantle systems, what would you say about equity through that lens?
Rock, paper, scissors? Who goes first?
Yeah, exactly. We all three of us have so much to say, and now we're all saying nothing.
Yeah, we're just trying to defer. I always want to defer to
Dr. Jaber.
Oh,
Yep.
man. That's a lot of pressure, especially with this crowd. I think each of us obviously is very steeped in equity work in a lot of different ways based on our lived experiences. And for me, I think as a student growing up in this country and as somebody who went through most of graduate school, never being really able to name my experiences in formal ways, my biggest shift has to be to stop working for students and start thinking about how we can work with them and with their communities and really empowering and mobilizing the kids to be a part of that conversation in a lot of ways, shifting it to think about how we can involve them in the decisions that we make and empower them to understand this conversation, to be a part of the conversation, and to start shifting the status quo. I think that's a huge reframe because it means taking the power that we've historically held as educators in the classroom and giving it back to the students and really taking a back seat and being more of a facilitator and letting them take the lead. And that has probably been the most powerful shift I've made as an educator in my 20 plus years as an educator. And I think seeing the power that the students hold, seeing what they're able to produce, hearing them take part in that conversation. And then I always tell my students, when you know, pass the information forward. Watching the students lead the conversation in their communities, challenging their administration, I think, which is what my students did last year. They were able to stand up in front of the entire district administration and say, here's what you're not doing for us and here how you're not meeting our needs. Having them facilitate those conversations with their parents and help their parents arrive at new understandings, I think, was all huge. And it's much more powerful than me having a conversation with another adult, because when their children are challenging them and asking them questions and really able to have those conversations, those critical conversations in meaningful and powerful ways, it's transformative. And I always say, like, education will impact policy, right? Because if we have a generation of kids who understand inequity, understand oppression, understand marginalization, eventually we're all going to step down because we're going to get older and they're going to take over. And these are going to be our senators and our presidents and our lawyers and our Supreme Court judges and all of these different things, these different positions that hold the power and are able to really shift the conversation and contribute to it in large and meaningful ways.
This is why, right? Yeah. Number one, this is why we defer.
That was a TED Talk for you all not paying attention at home.
That's number one. So even just thinking about the question, I always think of ways in which we can simplify what we're looking for or looking at, but that we also unpack the complexity of it. And so the examples that come to mind for me is whenever I think of, so how do we make sure this environment, ISTE itself, how do we make sure our education systems at large, how do we make sure our local schools, how do we make sure they're all equitable? I think of 3 R's, and they are just helping me look through the lens of equity. And the first one is representation, right? It is what I can see with my eyes. Last time we were sitting in the hallway, all I do, and what I'm doing right now, I'm looking to see how many other people that look like me are here, right? That is incredibly important for my mental and emotional safety, more than anything. So is there representation? And with that representation, I know that there will be some relevance, at least with those who look like me, but then I'm also asking a question programmatically, where is representation? right? Where is that representation? But secondly, is it being responsive to my cultural identity and the cultural identity of others, and most especially of the students? And you think of public schools, and around 80% of our student population in public schools in so-called urban areas are students of color. And so is the instruction, is the what is expected of them, is it responsive to who they are and how they express themselves most comfortably, right? And then there's a last one, and it's a bigger one, and it's one that I think has just a larger question mark behind it, and that is, how are we instilling, or how are we creating opportunities for restitution? Right?
Speak about that.
Yeah, so restitution is paying back and giving back what has been taken, right? So if there has been things that have been taken from our community via appropriation, via even just talking about responsiveness and ways in which I may express myself culturally, and that has been vilified, that has been demonized, that has actually been disciplined often within our school systems. How do we not only, quote, reverse that? I'm putting all these quotes and asterisks next to statements because there's a lot that's there. Mm-hmm. But then how do we actually elevate them at their proper place and where they should be? And we should be celebrating, right? And we should start vilifying and demonizing the things that have been abusive or have been harmful to students of color and staff of color. And so restitution is all about creating restoration. And so that would be my fourth R to add to the mix. But oftentimes we stop at representation, not recognizing that we're just asking for people even put in positions of leadership to just go with the flow and to continue what has been already hurtful and harmful and will continue to be unless it's addressed and changed. And so bigger questions that I think if we unpack them as a community, we can look at ways that we can make some of those changes.
Just a little side note to piggyback off of that, and representation, thinking about people who live in third spaces, Ooh. Right? Because oftentimes, even when there's equity as like a focus, representation often excludes, for example, Arab students, yes. Asian students, and I think oftentimes I find myself missing in a lot of those conversations where there's intentional equity representation and conversation, and even in that narrative, right? So you don't have to have students who look like me to teach about our narrative, because these are kids that are going into a global world who need to understand the story, the single story, and the misrepresentation when they're interacting with or making decisions about or thinking about who to support politically with their tax dollars, or what all of those decisions that we have to make as American citizens, civically engaged American citizens. They need to understand these narratives in order for them to make those educated decisions. And so representation, not just in our mainstream, like I teach in a school as 80% Latinx students. When I talk and I teach in my classroom, I make sure to represent as many different groups and make sure that they understand that this is not an all-inclusive. So making sure that they also understand the narratives of people that look like them, seeing representation of themselves, but also understanding others, I think is huge.
Beautifully said. Nothing but concurrence.
Yeah, to kind of encapsulate what both Dr. Jaber and Dee shared, I think ultimately what I see missing that I certainly am hopeful for is an intentionality around what they both shared. I recognize that at a big conference like this, you have to have sessions that are the how-tos. My argument is even those how-tos can be appropriately representational, as Dr. Jaber, because a lot of people, first of all, let me be clear with this. Diversity is not a binary, and it cannot be defined in finite terms. There's a word, and it's funny because Dee is wearing a shirt that says, define CRT in a sentence. Oh, wait. And the reason why I'm saying this is because one of the 5 legal scholars that authored the critical race theory framework is Kimberly Crenshaw. And she coined a term that I love. Remember, I love the nuance of language. And it really ties in with what Dee and with Dr. Jaber just shared, and the term is intersectionality. And the whole idea around that is to encourage educators to really start to look at how the human condition cannot be a binary, is not a binary, and we should not be compartmentalized based on whatever our optics are, whatever our cultural identity is, what our background is. And the more that you recognize the importance around supporting students and asserting their own agency through civic engagement, I think that's one that I talk about that all the time. You got to support that. And then you get into, as Dee shared, the 3 R's. The main thing around that is the more that we support educators in recognizing and developing an awareness around those things, it can lead to the right degree of accelerated growth. And if you think about equity as a term, like, again, defining it, I define equity simply as access and opportunity. How are we providing access to a myriad of perspectives, a myriad of viewpoints, a myriad of lived experiences for the opportunity for us to be able to engage in learning that the catalyst, or part of the catalyst for that learning, is making meaningful cross-cultural connections. That's why when you don't make those connections, whether it's in a how-to session or in sessions that many of us do, what you do is you run the risk of people being able to be more easily compartmentalized and looking at learning, looking at the human condition as a binary. And then that's why when I always hear people say, well, this is divisive, I always follow up with, who's it dividing and why is it dividing them? What is the primary goal of that division? And then once we identify the goal, now we know where we can make efforts to dismantle it. So I'm certainly hopeful that the folks here at this conference going forward will begin to develop a stream of thought that extends far beyond just the how-to of a device or an app, or really even just the sessions they attended. Think about it in a larger social context.
Mm-hmm. Do you think big conferences like this do enough from your points of view? And how could they improve?
I'm going to say no.
Okay.
I'm going to say we're just barely, it's a drop in the ocean,
mm-hmm.
right? There's so much more that can be done. And I think that's representative of who takes the main stage. Like, I was floored to see Dr. Cornel West. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a very powerful moment for mm-hmm. every BIPOC person in the room. I would assume for many of us, mm-hmm. it was a really powerful moment to hear him say a lot of the things he said, affirming and just validating, and I think also just powerful, mm-hmm. right? To see somebody of his
stature,
so many things,
take
the stage and speak mm-hmm. unapologetically. I think that's new.
Mm-hmm.
I go to conferences all the time, and I think that was a really new experience, and it felt great. But I think, again, that representation is often barely touching the surface. It's
mm-hmm.
not there, we have to see more of that. We have to see more of that diversity. It has to be more intentional, and it has to be really getting at the core of what equity work, more than just mitigative, but transformative equity work, really getting to the core of what it takes to shift the powers in our communities, not just in our classrooms. I always say schools are community centers, and if we really are doing what we're supposed to be doing, we're serving entire communities that we reside in and we take space in. And so how are we talking about those conversations? It's beyond cultural responsiveness. It's beyond adding a diverse book in your curriculum. It's beyond hiring and quantifying how many BIPOC staff members you have and faculty members in your school, and assuming that you've checked that off of your list. And it's beyond a 15-minute webinar, and it's not a one and done. It's a framework, lifestyle change. It's systemic. It's from the top down, the bottom up, and all around. And it extends itself outside of the community in every possible way. And if we're not thinking about it in all of those ways, then we're not doing equity work, because it's not disrupting. It's a Band-Aid. And a Band-Aid can only last so long when you have a gashing wound that's bleeding, right? Like, it's not going to do anything. It's going to only hold up until you actually go get the right treatment that you need. And I don't know how many schools are really doing that work. So unless the organizers of massive conference like this start to think that way, that's where that conversation's missing from a lot of these spaces. And a lot of what we're seeing more of it.
Yeah.
But
it's more intentional, for sure.
For sure. But I definitely wouldn't say that we're where we need to be.
What advice would you give conferences?
I can answer that.
Yeah, I know Ken can for sure. So my first thought, not last thought, is language that I often utilize, because this is hard work and it's complex work. But first and foremost, just in education. So we understand certain things. There's some parallel language that we can utilize. People all know about, like, SAMR, right? We know how to evaluate tech and its use in classrooms, and so I say utilize something similar, and that's why I brought up, like, the 3 R's, and I say, what stage are we in at this place, in this point? So similarly to how it would be inappropriate to label someone a teacher as you are on the A level. No, in a particular activity and in a particular environment, they may utilize something that is on the S level. I say that you asked the first question or the previous question of, how are we doing here? And I'm like, well, let's define, like, at what point, at what place, when the main stage conversation, or excuse me, all of the main stage of yesterday, I thought, wow, I see the representation, I hear and feel the responsiveness, and I'm now also hearing with unapologetic language, even restitution. But that's just in this space. But what about the other spaces? So how do we evaluate where we are and what we're doing at each instance in every little venue? ISTE is huge, right? So how are we doing in a particular place at a particular time? And then how do we continue to level up? Because representation is just the very first step. So if we see representation, great, but you're not getting a cookie. And how do we level it up?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, to, again, encapsulate what Dr. Jaber and Dee shared, I think, one, you got to name a problem for what it is before you can fix it, period. And there are definitely significant efforts to maintain a degree of myopia, because I can absolve myself of any responsibility if I can performatively claim that I'm not aware of something. And it's like the horse with the blinders. I'm telling you how you can take those blinders off, and you are intentionally saying, I don't want to take them off. So for me, and this is something I always challenge educators. If you don't want to take the blinders off, then I'm going to force you to hold a mirror up there. You're still going to look at something that isn't what you've always been looking at. When it comes to conferences like ISTE, big conferences in general, the advice I always give is, how are you ensuring that the program, the presenters, the main stage folks are truly representational of, one, the educator workforce, and two, the students they serve? Because if, to Dee's point, if we were at conferences that, let's say their primary attendees are public school teachers, then 80% of the presenters should be those whose cultural identity is aligned with Black, Indigenous, people of color. But I also recognize that you want to have a nice cross-representation. But my main thing is, how do you discern the difference between authenticity and performative natures around that? And it does you no good. I'm going to borrow a quote from James Baldwin, one of my personal heroes, who, by the way, I was never given the opportunity to read his writings in high school, outside of my dad having me do it. Why would I want to integrate into a burning house? The whole idea around the intentionality of diversity, and like Dr. Jaber shared, checking off a box. I can say that I know for a fact that I've been tokenized and I've been a checkbox when I go to a conference and there's more than 1,000 people there, and like Dee shared earlier, and I look around and I'm the only one. And so for me, it's not just the whole idea around ensuring equity, ensuring diversity, it's how are you ensuring that the very people that you are inviting into that space are safe and protected. And then once you have that, and we begin to dialogue with each other and make the connections and things of that nature, it then becomes this beautifully diverse space of which I always say, what do you need in order to ensure that the presenters and the attendees can bring their whole true authentic selves into that space? So the advice I always give conferences is, one, I'd like to see your representation of speakers. Two, what resource supports are provided to ensure the safety, both social and emotional safety of those speakers. How do I see it operationalized in the program? How do I see it operationalized in here you go, not just in the program, what room am I assigned to? What time is my session? I've been around for a while where my session on Tequity was rejected. Then it got accepted. Last session, last day, back of the conference center. Then it got accepted the next time. Very first session on the very second day at 8 a.m. So you see, it's the whole thing, because I know that some folks want to, again, remember, I always, bad faith actors versus good faith actors. I know you're in good faith if you're saying not only are we ensuring diversity of representation in the program and the content, but we're not taking those sessions and burying them at the worst possible time and or worst possible location.
I think you know it's effective when it becomes the norm and not the anomaly, right? You're like,
Exactly.
I think that feeling that we all have
Yeah.
listening to Dr. Cornell West is indicative of the fact that this is not the norm for us, right? And so like I walk around here, and it's also about like who are we attracting to attend these conferences too? When you talk about like safety of spaces, that's what I think of, because I look around and I see almost nobody who looks like me. Not on the main stage, not in the sessions, not in the hallways. I'm oftentimes the only person who looks like me in a space like this. And that by itself brings a whole level of discomfort and pressure, because I feel like I have this responsibility to represent. Because when I speak, people are looking at me, and I'm dismantling so many single story stereotypes just by being present in these spaces. So that's a lot of pressure for one person, right? And it's only my story. It's not every Arab Muslim woman's story.
I want to tell you, a Muslim woman walked by while we were here, and I had to I was choking back tears because she was so proud to see you at this table having this conversation. And it was a beautiful thing to see. But it goes to what you're talking about. She shouldn't have to walk by and be proud. It should be normalized. And that's where we need to get to.
Yeah, that represents, like, what I wanted to show everybody today was I walked by a booth in the expo hall and saw a little pin with a hijabi girl wearing jeans and a shirt. And I was like emotionally touched, because I think this is the first time in my life, and I'm 42 years old, that I see an accurate representation of a Muslim American girl.
Looks like your daughter.
She looks like my daughter.
She looks like your
in
daughter.
my life. This is the first time. Like, that's so huge.
What was the company?
Lexia Learning, and
Okay.
kudos to
Shout
them.
out.
And that's
Kudos to
it.
them.
And here's the thing, that's in the vendor hall, and that's a pin. Now take that and amplify that to Dr. Jaber is now on the main stage or delivering a session. Now extrapolate that to, again, like you shared, like Dr. Jaber shared, when you are intentional and authentic, it's not the anomaly, it's not the oh my God. It's normalized. It has to be normalized. It really does.
And what Kid was also communicating about authenticity and having good faith actors versus bad faith actors. I mean, one of the things that come to mind for me is I intentionally utilize the language of responsiveness versus relevance. Not that they're opposed, because they're very much similar, but oftentimes they're used interchangeably. And Ken and I have lots of discussions around words really, really matter. And within normal context, I recognize that relevance means, in my layman terms, it means that it's relevant to me, it can appeal to me, I can understand it, something like that. Well, if there's someone who is very remote from my experience, their ability to communicate something relevantly is going to be limited based on their very limited experience, exposure, and opportunity to do so. But being responsive is actually, even just in the language, it is posturing yourself with humility and listening. And then communicating or acting in a more relevant way, because you're responding to something that you are understanding that I need to learn more about and to understand on the cognitive and emotional heart level. And so that's why I elevate the language of responsiveness, because we're not going to get representation like that, and we're not going to get relevance for sure like that. But if we have a heart and emotional, and even on the leadership level, if we have a responsiveness of learning, then we can actually do some things that are more relevant within our setting.
Right.
Well, I have to say, I knew this would end way too soon. This should have been 4 sessions in a row, because the brain power at this table and the experience that you bring, there's not enough time. But I'm super happy to have had this conversation. We need to wrap it up, but I just want to know, is there anything you feel you need to say to wrap this up?
I said mine.
I yield my time to Dr. Jaber's brilliance.
Okay.
Oh man, I don't have anything to add to this. Like, there's so much to say, right? Like when you're talking about the equity conversation, I just think it's it's something that we can go on and on and on, because there's so many inequities in every space that we occupy, and especially as educators, I think it's a question of who you're bringing into those spaces. How do you retain those people? Because there's so many of us. Like, I attended the first iGrow Summit, which was the first BIPOC conference, leadership conference in Illinois, and it was such a completely different space, because you're in a space where there's only people who look like you, even though I was still the only Arab and the only Muslim in that space then too, but like other BIPOC teachers, and there's a shared experience there. And I think there was a representative there from the Illinois State Board of Education who stood up and said, where Illinois is starting this new grant to help 300 BIPOC teachers become principals. And in my mind, I was just thinking to myself, how many BIPOC teachers are already in spaces that are, and they have their leadership credentials, but the gatekeepers will not allow them to grow in those spaces. So before we start thinking that we're taking on these new initiatives and we're being so responsive to the needs, and we're equitable, and we're this PR moments that Illinois State Board of Education is taking to really highlight their commitment to changing the way they've thought historically. Let's look at the problem that we really have that already exists. So I approached him and I said, hey, I just want to ask you a question. Like, did you ever think that there's already teachers out there who have credentials and are overqualified, but your superintendents that are primarily white and the people who make the decisions will not allow them to grow because they're the gatekeepers? What are you doing to solve that problem? And he just looked at me like 6 question marks, no answer. He said, would you like to be on a committee? Of course, because we have to do the work to change the narrative. Because if we're not doing the work, if we're not telling that story, if we're not standing in those committees and serving on 15 different committees and wearing 10 different hats, where you're constantly being re-traumatized in these spaces and then demonized for being the angry black or brown person on the table, and often the only voice in that space who's speaking that among a sea of whiteness, then the work isn't happening, right? And so I think all of that warrants attention, and people really need to look at the core of the problem and not the optics of what they want it to be, because it's an easy fix or another Band-Aid, right? And so there's so much. A drop in the ocean.
I'm sorry for the shortness of this session, because I am learning so much. So thank you, everyone, for coming, and maybe next year it'll be all day. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.